First of all, thank you for making time to talk on this sensitive issue. As you all know, the civil war in Ethiopia has been more than 20 months now, and it's still, the dynamics is shifting. There are so many players and actors, both at domestic and the national level, and the war has spread to the other parts of the country, as you may all know. But most recently, there is a humanitarian truce which has been signed between the government and the TPLF, or the rebel group. There are also some issues in the southern part of the country, especially in the Oromia region. So we have an expert who will give us his insight and experience on that perspective. His name is Dr. ABEBE, who is a lawyer by profession, and now he's a program officer at IDEA, and he is working on democratization and constitutionalism. He can say a bit about himself maybe before presentation. Then the other guest is LIDET TADESSE SHIFERAW. She will speak about the role of civil society, regional security organizations, and others such as IGAD, African Union, and generally she will give us the role that these different actors play in making peace and conflict resolution. So welcome, LIDET as well. And finally, we have here Dr. ABDULLAH YOUSEF from University of Dundee, Scotland. He used to be somehow my former professor, but informally. So we have him here. He always have a podcast on the Horn of Africa, including Ethiopia. I myself had a couple of podcasts with him. So he will focus generally on the comparative aspect, giving us some historical lessons, the background to the conflict, mainly focusing on the consequences, not on the causes. Dr. Adam will deal with the causes. So this being said, I am MOGES TESHOME, originally from Ethiopia, and a project assistant at the International Institute for Peace. With that, I will give the mic back to Stephanie FENKART, which is the director of the institute. So I hope we'll have a fruitful discussion. This is all from my part. Welcome again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, MOGES. My name is Stephanie. You already mentioned I'm going to be moderating today for the next hour and 15 minutes. We will see. We have it's a hybrid event, so people can also join via Zoom. So please feel free to ask questions via Zoom. We are also live on Facebook and live on YouTube. So we look forward to an interesting discussion. The topic of today is the Ethiopian civil war, challenges to and prospects for peace. Here we are at the International Institute for Peace, and I think it is very important, especially also for us, to talk also when it comes to war times, to talk about peace as well. It has now been more than 18 months since the civil war in the northern part of Ethiopia started, with devastating humanitarian crisis, deteriorating security in Ethiopia. The war already has claimed many, many lives, displaced even much more. The social fabric is torn, the political polarization grew faster, and territorial integrity of the country has been challenged. Despite some efforts also after African Union when it comes to mediation, the war still has spread to the entire northern part of the country. In March, the government introduced a unilateral humanitarian truce, and I think we will also talk a little bit about the humanitarian truce. Can it be a prospect? Is it a window of opportunity maybe also to deal in a different way with the conflict in Ethiopia? The attention, very unfortunately, of the international community and also in Europe is not really so much on Ethiopia, and this is of course also due to the conflict in Ukraine, which is very much important in Europe, but we see that very unfortunately African topics are not really that high on the agenda, and this is especially important for us as an Institute for Peace, that we also want to remind people that there are still more conflicts, conflicts are all over the world, and we need to address them with all our strength. I would like to welcome all of you very, very kindly. It's very nice to have two speakers on Zoom. Unfortunately, it would be nice also to have you here, but it's better to have you here via Zoom than not having you, of course. And Zoom also gives us an opportunity that you can join us easily. And I'm also very happy that we have one guest who came from the UK. It was a little bit difficult with traveling, and the flight was cancelled and the flight was delayed. So I'm very, very happy that you can join us today here in person. Nevertheless, I would like now to start maybe the first 10 minutes with Dr. ADEM KASSIE ABEBE. He holds a Doctor of Laws from the University of Pretoria, and he's also a regular commentator on Ethiopian politics. And I would already have a question, which is maybe you can share with us what are the structural, social, political, economic and legal causes also of the civil war, and how could they be addressed? And since I also managed the humanitarian truce, I mean, do you think there is something like a blueprint maybe for peace in Ethiopia? I know the question is quite broad and it's probably difficult to answer it within the next 10 minutes, but please just shed some lights on the recent developments. What is at stake? How is the situation now in Ethiopia? And thank you so much for joining.
Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Stephanie, thank you very much for having me. And MOGES also for reaching out. I really appreciate it. And I want to apologize. I actually wanted to come. Unfortunately, I've had a few traveling obligations before. And I have a young family, so it's a bit burdensome. And so I had to do it virtually, but I'm glad that I can join. So I have been asked to speak primarily, as you raised, on the structural issues and possibilities for peace in terms of the most recent developments. And I have about 10 minutes. I'll try and be as precise as possible. First, I think it will be useful for the audience to realize that since the age of political pluralism in Ethiopia, which is around 1940s, 1950s, Ethiopia has always been an authoritarian system, and at the same time also unstable. In particular, since the overthrow of the imperial regime in 1974, Ethiopia has consistently, until today, been unstable. And now the location of the instability, the scope, the degree of brutalities may have changed, may have shifted, but the country has been authoritarian and at the same time unstable. And so there's a certain sense of continuity in that sense. But that's one. Now, why is that the case? And for me, if there's one reason for why we are in this problem, I can frame it as a political culture of fundamentalism. Fundamentalism, not in a religious sense, but fundamentalism in the way political actors perceive their ideas and in the way the political actors perceive those with different, sometimes conflicting ideas around how the country should be understood, its history, but also how the institutions should be designed and operationalized. And so there is that fundamentalism in our thinking, and I call it fundamentalism. If you look at it, the former first regime that overthrew the imperial regime, the Derg, the communist Derg regime, you'll see that we have a ruling clique that had its own ideas, and everybody that did not agree with those ideas was labeled as an enemy, not just of the government, but of the country, of the people of Ethiopia. And the opposition to the Derg was precisely the same. And so the way the opposition saw themselves and saw the ruling elite, but also other opposition groups, was with the same level of fundamentalism, in the sense that our ideas are pure, and anything that that involves compromise is seen as undermining. It's seen as undermining the purpose of the struggle. And now, along this fundamental, I think, structural issue, we have other things. For me, the second relevant factor is what I consider is personalized politics. If you look at the Derg, we had a ruler, Mengistu Haile Mariam. He was too powerful, and so even if we had even if there's a sense of understanding of a strong party, that party was incapable of controlling its leader. And any party, in my opinion, that is incapable of controlling its leader is a weak party. It's a personalized regime. And the same happened under Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. Of course, the structures were there, the party was delivering, but the party again was incapable of significantly checking the government of the then Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. And since 2018, we also kind of have the same kind of party, and perhaps even much weaker. It's still a new party, but we can already see that the person is too big. The leadership of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is too big for the party. And again, so you have this continuity of authoritarianism, continuity of instability, and continuity, in my opinion, of personalized politics. Even if the strength of the party shifted now and then, in reality, the parties were incapable of controlling their leadership. And I consider those parties weak parts. So that's another fundamental structural problem. And of course, in connection with particularly the first one, the political culture of fundamentalism that I spoke about earlier, there is also a problem of mistrust in the sense that anything different is seen as a betrayal of the cause of not just the politics of the country, but the idea of the country. And finally, and I'll quickly jump into the second part of the presentation. And I also consider the lack of a coalition of opposition forces, of civil society organizations, and broadly the public intellectuals, a coalition of opposition groups, civil society, and public intellectuals of democracy. So we need a coalition of democracy that first pursues a single, if possible, a single agenda towards the democracy. As a country, we had we've kind of answered what we call the question of land and the question of nationalities, but we are yet to answer the question of democracy, and that is where we keep getting stuck at. And I think if opposition groups even today want to make a difference, they have to coalesce, set aside their differences, focus more on the cooperative part to building the conditions for a democracy. And then once the democratic system has been set up, at least the basics of it has been set up, they can start then competing on their distinct ideas. But until a democratic system is established, whether it's opposition groups, civil society organizations, the public broadly would find it very difficult. To lead, to be able to essentially present their ideas and compete on those ideas. And I think that is precisely why this particular transition has kind of failed. I think if in 2018, if the opposition force and civil society had aligned together, rather than competing, if they had aligned together on a single agenda of generating momentum towards a genuine dialogue and setting the conditions and enabling conditions for democracy, perhaps they would have had the power to counterbalance the emergence of a new, extremely personalized, powerful actor. And so these are, I think, the fundamental questions. And of course, there are other issues, including poverty and the extreme politicization of identity politics. And in particular, the way identity politics has led to, in my opinion, the fundamental challenge of intra-group competition with some in a particular group trying to be or to present themselves as the genuine manifestation of a particular group. And that intra-group competition then informing and perhaps generating and escalating inter-group conflicts across the country. But these, in my opinion, are perhaps triggers. These are the enablers of what I consider are the fundamental weakness in our fundamental structural weaknesses in the way our society and our political thinking is organized. And that is, as I said, first, political culture of fundamentalism. Second, personalized politics, weak parties. Third, the lack of a coalition, a cohesive coalition for democracy. And of course, as I said, in connection with all of this, mistrust. Now, in the case of this particular conflict, again, these were the conditions, but of course, the competition within the ruling party at that particular time, that essentially fragmented. So the ruling party, the Prime Minister Abiy and the former Amhara leaders had to essentially break the EPRDF, the former ruling party, to be able to rule it, to be able to control it. But they have not managed to reconstruct it, and so they broke it so they can rule it, but they have not managed to put it back. And I think that is where the conflict started. And of course, there were reasons that escalated the situation, including first the transformation of the ruling party into a new prosperity party. That was one of the triggers. And secondly, the peace process with Eritrea and the sense of exclusion of the TPLF. It should have been at least a three-actor engagement, but unfortunately, for reasons that I will not go into detail, it kind of excluded the Tigrayan ruling elite. And that, of course, created a sense of conspiracy, a sense of fear, and that generated the conflict further. And there were, of course, land disputes, particularly between Amhara and Tigray, and ultimately the postponement of the elections. But again, for me, the structures for conflict were always laid down. And what we saw after what happened to the ruling party and with Eritrea and the land dispute and the elections is essentially, for me, the triggers. They really are the immediate cause, if you will. Now, the conflict, as we know, has been raging. Hundreds and thousands of people have perished. The humanitarian situation is unimaginable, particularly in Tigray. There is extremely difficult restrictions. There have been restrictions, particularly since November, December last year. Since June, June 2021, there have been significant restrictions of access to humanitarian provisions and other necessary supplies, and that obviously has created significant humanitarian problems. And of course, the invasion of the Tigrayan forces of areas of Afar, neighboring Afar and Amhara regions, essentially expanded the geography of the humanitarian needs and created more problems also to what was happening in Tigray. Now, both sides have kind of tried their luck, and that's what I think. The federal government and its allies tried to crush the TPLF. They didn't succeed. The TPLF then tried to overrun the government. It didn't. And now I think there is a sense, and this is my sense, there is a sense that they cannot get what they want through force. And of course, there's a lot of international pressure as well to try and solve the problem through peaceful means. And the economy is in tatters. So the country needs a lot of pumping of foreign currency. And so in combination, I think the fact that all parties have kind of tried and have exhausted, there is international pressure, and the economy can perhaps no longer sustain another round of conflict, and a permanent state of conflict, are pushing the parties towards peace. And the humanitarian truce that was announced in March kind of came on that background. But I'm happy to report that I think for the last 6 months or so, there haven't been any large-scale confrontations. And we also know that particularly the African Union Special Envoy, Olusegun Obasanjo, has been engaged in a shuttle diplomacy. He was in Mekelle recently. He was with Abiy Ahmed and other actors. And he has very recently said he was optimistic that things, some of the naughty things may actually be untied in quicker than a lot of people think. And I am hopeful that will happen as well. And I hope also that our leadership essentially use this opportunity. I think other country, we have suffered, and perhaps this is I think in recent African history, this is the worst civil war we've seen in Africa. And what I hope in this country is that the momentum towards peace, it's still fragile, but it can be seized and it can be materialized. And if we can learn from this gruesome reality, if we can learn from the trauma of the past 18 or so months and from before, then we can actually lay the foundation for a strong process of national dialogue and also a strong process towards democratization. But I'll say one thing and conclude, and that is that there is a possibility for national dialogue to work, and there's a possibility to move towards democracy as well. But opposition groups should not make the same mistake they did in 2018. And I encourage them, if there's anybody listening, I would encourage them to band together and focus on one agenda. They have differences, some of them very, very difficult, very hard to bridge, but they cannot realize any of their ideas unless the country engages in a genuine dialogue and unless the country then transits into a democratic dispensation. And the only way to counter the emerging personalized and highly dominant power system is to band together. And I hope they will do that. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. I think you tackled already many issues, and you talked about authoritarian system, personal politics, culture of fundamentalism, and especially also distrust. You also said, and I think this is also a very important point, is also the lack of coalition of civil society organizations when it comes also to democracy. And I think this is also something which I hope that also maybe LIDET can touch a little bit upon. And LIDET is going to be our next speaker. She's an associate director of Peaceful Societies and Accountable Governance, now in Maastricht, as far as I know. And I would have maybe two questions for you. We talked a little bit, Adam talked a little bit about the humanitarian truce, and also that violence is a little bit, violence went a little bit less down. But what role can you say did, for example, what role did the African Union have in this context? I mentioned in my initial remarks that they have been doing some mediation efforts, also with the support, as far as I know, from international organizations. But what would you say from the African Union point of view? What are the successes and limitations of the African Union when it comes to the conflict in Ethiopia, and probably also to the Horn of Africa? But then also, I mean, what role do and can civil society organizations and also women have in the conflict? We know that in a conflict, mostly women, elderly people, children are the most vulnerable ones, but they also are not only victims, but they are also quite also the contrary, and they can also have some conflict transformational power. So please also feel free to reflect on what Adam has been said, and thanks for joining, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hello, everyone. Good evening. So, Stephanie, maybe I will respond to your questions by, even before responding to it, by talking about the landscape for mediation, because in a way, for people who have been observing or living this conflict for such a long time, I think it's worthy of appreciation that now, a year and a half after a lot of devastation and a lot of violence, this talk of negotiation or mediation is not as highly politicized as it used to be, or that even in the daily news or could also be social media banters that we're so familiar with, the idea of negotiation being part of the conversation, I think, is in a way positive, because at some point during the war, and at different points it was different actors, but the idea of negotiation and the idea of sitting with the other has been completely unacceptable, especially for the conflicting parties. This sort of reflects to what Adam was saying in terms of fundamentalism, and how some sort of compromise is seen as betrayal of the cause or the nation or the country or whatever it is. So maybe I'll start by saying a few things about that and the overall mediation landscape, and then I will talk about the role of the AU thus far and what have we seen in the past few months in particular, and then I will say a few things about the role of civil society. So as I said, these days we have indeed seen a change in narrative, and maybe some sort of depolarization or softening of positions, not softening of positions in which you would automatically see the federal government and TPLF changing its positions per se, but at least that a mediated settlement to the conflict is possible. That idea increasingly is coming to the fore, and both political and social discourse, which is a positive thing. And this is in contrast to, as I said, how the federal government, for example, approached it at the very beginning, where the federal government's position was an absolute rejection of a political settlement. And then at another time, it was the TPLF that completely rejected the possibility of a negotiated settlement. And like Adam said, both of these calculations by the actors were a result of both parties believe that there is a military solution to this, and that victory would be on their side. And now that the conflict and facts on the ground, as they would say, has demonstrated that it's not possible to completely overpower or completely annihilate the other, I think both sides are increasingly taking a pragmatic step into considering political negotiations and perhaps having their interests and demands be met through this political negotiation. And here, I think, in addition to what the combat has demonstrated, the fact that you can't really annihilate the other, it's also that, you know, the war, the intensity of the war, the intensity of combat having subsided, and the international discourse, especially the international media and diplomacy forged by international partners, it has also changed in a way. So also them taking a pragmatic step. And now we see a situation in which things on the ground are also moving positively, as Adam said, particularly in light of access to humanitarian organizations, which has improved. Now, having said that, and talking about the role of the AU, now the most promising and the most discussed process is, of course, the one that is led by Obasanjo. But even before former President Obasanjo was appointed as the High Representative for the Horn, the AU had tried indeed to send some envoys to Addis Ababa. And this was soon after the war started, so this was still in November 2020. But the federal government wasn't really amenable to the idea of welcoming these envoys and then starting a negotiation with them. And part of it has to do with, again, the federal government thinking that it would be able to manage this conflict in a relatively short time and achieve some sort of military victory, which at the first phase of the war did happen because the federal government was able to take control of much of the territories within Tigray, but in a way also short-sighted. And once the war progressed and TPLF also, became on the offensive and the federal government was really on the defensive, the appointment of the former president Obasanjo came into play. And while the federal government never really made a strong preference to one mediator over the other, the TPLF did raise some questions, particularly not just on Obasanjo's personality per se, but on the procedures of the AU, because the TPLF really did believe that the AU was biased towards the federal government, having seen that the AU didn't really align with or didn't really, for example, issue statements on what the federal government or like this combat in general. And this has to do with the fact that the AU, being an intergovernmental organization, of course, is really governed by the will of its member states. So it is a continental organization that doesn't have a superseding authority over the decisions of member states. And from the get-go, the federal government of Ethiopia was also framing this as a highly internal issue that the federal government has full authority to manage. And it's important to note that even in terms of narrative, it was considered a law enforcement procedure or a law enforcement process at the very beginning. So even the idea of war or civil conflict is something that the federal government only recently adopted, if at all. Having said that, it's also, I think, interesting to note that the appointment, and this I think has to do with the AU being an intergovernmental organization, the appointment of Obasanjo, although we all know that his primary duty or responsibility is really trying to bridge the differences between TPLF and the federal government, his title is actually High Representative for the Horn. So it's not just for Ethiopia. And again, I think this is partly to avoid hardening of positions and the AU trying to take a bit of a diplomatic stance vis-a-vis the state. Not because Ethiopia is special per se, but I think this is how the AU would have approached it in other contexts as well. But nonetheless, the TPLF having expressed some concerns about the position of the AU, since a lot has changed since the appointment of Obasanjo in August 2021. Now we have seen Obasanjo going, from Addis to Mekelle to talk to all parties, or both sides at least. In his latest interview, he was of the opinion that there has been slow but steady progress. And as Adam mentioned, right now, especially in terms of access for humanitarian access, I think there's a lot of improvement on the ground, even if some political and to a large extent operational challenges also remain, and the humanitarian disaster in Tigray is also quite significant, and the whole scale of it actually is also not properly known. And the region is also, disconnected from the rest of the country, and basic services have not been restored in Tigray. Nonetheless, I think in terms of political attitudes from both sides, you see some changes. However, while this is promising, I think even this process itself requires extreme caution. And we shouldn't really assume at this point that some sort of settlement devised by him and the parties that he's speaking to will really solve the problem. And that is because, due to the nature of the conflict and the actors, multiplicity of actors involved with strong interests, it would be important to ensure that the interests of every political actor involved in this war is considered. Because here, in this case, what matters is not the end per se, but also the process. So how did we achieve some sort of political settlement? And here, any actor that feels excluded from the settlement, or any actor that feels its interests are not reflected in the negotiations, is likely to form alliances. So all of these actors that have grievances are likely to form alliances and undermine the process as it is now, but also in the future undermine the sustainability of any type of peace that could potentially be achieved. So this could also be, if not properly managed, it could be a recipe for a future war. And here I would, most notably emphasize the concerns of the political actors in Amhara region and Afar region, who have been, at the forefront of the war, the forefront of combat as well, and their concerns and their role in the mediation process needs to be made more clear, and their concerns need to be taken on board, because at least from now what we see on the media, and a lot of the Obasanjo process is opaque, but what we see in the media, the conversations are really happening between Mekelle and Addis Ababa, so TPLF and the federal government, and not necessarily including Afar and Amhara. And another important actor, of course, is Eritrea. Adam has earlier mentioned a few things about Eritrea. And while in Amhara and Afar, just broadly speaking, political actors may not necessarily absolutely reject a political negotiation with TPLF. They would want to know under what conditions these negotiations are had, and then they would also want to put down their demands on the table. So that's how one would, sort of generalize what their position is. Eritrea, on the other hand, still seems to believe that a military solution is possible. Nonetheless, because this stance is, radically different from other stances, I don't think it should just be ignored completely. And even that, why is it that, what are some of Eritrea's concerns, and what are some of its demands, and whether or not these could be achieved in a non-military way should be pursued. So it would be, I think, unconstructive to just assume Eritrea as a spoiler even before the process begins. Now the third and last point is around civil society, because we've talked a lot about what political actors and politicians could do in terms of fostering or achieving some sort of political settlement or deal, mediated deal. And I would say that, theoretically, in this case, civil society could play this role of mobilizing for peace, preparing the broader society for peace. This is important in this case because at different phases of the conflict, particularly when TPLF became on the offensive, there has been substantial popular mobilization towards the war effort. So at the end, both in the side of Tigray, but in the rest of the country, it's also average citizens who were called to support the armed forces or who were called also to join combat. So the level of popular participation in this war is substantial. And in order to achieve peace, people's attitudes also needs to be changed. People's attitudes also needs to be open to the idea of peace and coexistence. And there, civil society could have significant roles in, mending the social ties and the social fabric that has been disproportionately degraded during this war. However, I would also say that, realistically speaking, civil society in Ethiopia is, number one, very nascent, and then number two, also highly politicized. This is, due to a number of factors and a combination of them at that. But the one of the fundamental causes here is that civil society during EPRDF rule, so before 2018, was really tight. So you didn't have a permissive civil society space in which people and associations could exist outside of the wing of the ruling party. So during that time, there were legal barriers for civil and political barriers for civil society engagement in the country. And that has limited the role of civil society actors in any social, political, and economic life of the country. I mean, and not just civil society, but also the media. So aside from sports and entertainment, we really didn't have a lot of critical media that engaged in politics, for example. And these legal and some of the procedural barriers have been corrected, let's say, so officially since 2018. However, even since then, like the political landscape of the country, which since then has also been extremely polarized, civil society also at this point in Ethiopia is extremely polarized. And there are affiliations of civil society is not really professionalized and representing the constituencies, or differentiated constituencies in the society, and one could very easily identify the political camps that many civil society organizations would belong to, and those that could also potentially do a lot of good, and those that would have interventions in terms of governance, human rights, or even peace building. There are some initiatives ongoing in the country, but most of them implement them at very specific localities. So you still don't have very professionalized and a very networked civil society that could, for example, implement peace building initiative at scale. I mean, as things stand, especially with regards to CSOs, it's really hard to say that there is, vibrant and capable CSO coalition that would really facilitate Ethiopia's path to peace. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, both in changing course, so like from wartime engagement to peacetime engagement, and this is a bit of a paradigm shift, I think. And then this is also in terms of the professionalization and alliance building among civil society organizations in the country. So going forward, I think the takeaway, and I will just conclude with this, on the one hand, the kind of political negotiations and settlements that the Obasanjo process or others in due time would forge are quite important, but they would also be very ineffective if it's not also supported by the activities and actions of non-state actors like civil society organizations, which at this point have a promising start, but still require substantive level of re-steering and reorganization in order to have an impact going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, LIDET. I think you also touched upon many important issues. I mean, you said that compromise is very often seen as betrayal, and we can also witness this in many other conflicts as well, how difficult it is also to sell a compromise as a win-win situation. I think this is really a very important topic, and also that you believe that winning by only military means is also something which is very deep in many minds. And about the African Union, yeah, that it depends on the member states. We know that as European Union members, we all face the same problems, I would say. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on it. Last but not least, Abdullah, maybe on what you already heard. You can add on what you already heard, but I would also like to see a little bit on the geopolitical component, maybe. Like, what does it mean for the whole Horn of Africa? I mean, what are the interests maybe also of maybe neighboring states? I mean, it could be to the east as well. I mean, be it the Gulf states. I mean, China is present in all African countries. What would be your take on the situation there? How do you see any opportunity to get out of this situation in Ethiopia? And in what time frame do you think this could be something possible? Please.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm quite exhausted.
Use the mic, please. You need to.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Does it sound okay? Yeah, okay. Sorry, I'm quite exhausted.
You need to speak into the mic because otherwise they don't hear you on Zoom.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not used to like with mic. So basically, I'm quite exhausted. I've been traveling, last 48 hours, and it seems like Vienna is quite warm as well. It's like I just came from Dundee, so a bit of I'm quite disoriented. But I'll try my best to cover some of the things about like from international relations point of view. That's my subject area. A quick disclaimer. I mean, I'm not Ethiopia expert. I mean, I've got very limited expertise on Ethiopia. I did a couple of podcasts with like MOGES, I think 4 or 5 sessions. So those are quite comprehensive if someone is interested to know more about history and other things. But one thing I really want to cover is like the international system. I think that's important to actually understand why these things happening and what does it mean? Like what are the consequences of this? Like when I was following the initial stages of this war, so this man, Abiy Ahmed, I mean, he was saying that this is a military operation, this is a maximum 10 days. Okay, so when someone claims that, the war will be finished in 10 days, never trust them. So like Saddam Hussein did it in 1979, 1980 when like Iranian revolution happened. So Iran just collapsed. And suddenly Saddam Hussein thought that Iran, the new revolutionary leader, might be a kind of problem for, does it sound okay?
Yes, but if you touch the top of it, you can hear the, yeah, just, yeah.
Okay. This
Perfect.
Way? Okay. So like Saddam Hussein has got kind of similar situation where he thought this revolutionary leader in Iran might be a problem for him, and he tried to preempt it. And before the invasion in Iran, he was briefing his generals that we will be in Tehran in 72 hours. Iran-Iraq war finished after 8 years. And he's never been even close to Tehran. He was still fighting in the border. And if you see this, like this Ethiopia situation, at one point, so like Abiy was saying that we'll finish this war in like 10 days or 2 weeks. At one point, Tigray actually came towards him up to almost like Addis Ababa. So it's like kind of similar kind of situation, how like one person's like ambition can create serious mission creep. Now it's like more than close to like 18 months now. So from 10 days to 18 days, and we are nowhere near any of those like solution or anything. So like from like IR perspective, like one of the key authors is Kenneth Walls. He talks about those things in his famous book, 1959 book. It's called Man, the State, and the War. So it's like three level. He tries to explain how the conflict kind of occurs. So like as an individual level, what like Saddam Hussein did, going to Tehran in 72 hours or like this kind of military expedition, that's the man's role. And when they do it, it has got consequences if it doesn't work. And historically, it never worked. Even if you look at the Korean War, 1950s, like Truman, all those people, even like MacArthur, 5-star general, he thought that, you'd go to Korea and more or less finish it in a couple of days, months. And at one point, actually, North Korea came back and, it's like now like 32 like parallel line. It's still not resolved. So the problem is like with this kind of conflict situation, when the military expedition occurred for some reason, from individual kind of his or her personal endeavor, that can escalate things very quickly. So in terms of Iran-Iraq war, the war ended after 8 years. So if you talk about the state level, what was happening in the state level, so while Iraq was fighting against Iran, there's a bordering country, Kuwait, and there is a neighboring oil field there, and during that time, Kuwait was drilling oil from Iraqi area, basically stealing oil. And in 8 years' time, they stole almost, I think, $4 billion worth oil from Iraq. Okay. So if you go further, you can see that escalated the second war, second Gulf War, which is when Iraq invaded Kuwait, because one of those grievances that Kuwait stole their oil. So if you look at the Ethiopia situation, the way things are, so this conflict is creating problem and weakening the country, Ethiopia. So if you look at before this conflict, Ethiopia was doing fine in terms of economy, in terms of GDP, growing exponentially. And also if you look at Ethiopia is always prone to famine. And you can see I think 1991 or 93, the previous government, he promised one thing one thing I can promise to my people, that Ethiopians will get 3 meals a day. So if you look at the history up to today, there is no famine. So Ethiopia somehow managed to control those things in terms of this prone to famine and then escalation. But I think with this conflict now we came to a position where this thing can actually happen. The famine can happen, and serious number of people can actually die. And I think this humanitarian truce has got that kind of signature thing there. Because I think Abiy Ahmed is now actually worried. Because if it escalates that way, and if, we are talking about, million people die, just from hunger, or starvation, or this food crisis, I don't think international community will actually forgive Abiy Ahmed. So that's the end of his more or less career. So from the guy who won the Nobel Peace Prize, and then he can actually end up with ICC, International Criminal Court, because of, these are war crimes basically. Okay. So in terms of state level, how Kuwait was creating problem for Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war. So if you look at this current scenario, suddenly you can see Sudan is kind of militarized the border totally, because Ethiopia just cannot open another front line. And between Sudan and Ethiopia, there is one of the most fertile land. So which is basically more or less both parties could have been sharing for years. So suddenly now Sudan was controlling that thing. So how the state becomes weakened, and then how it gives opportunity to the surrounding countries to take advantage of that country. So if you look at Saddam Hussein 1979-80, Iraqi GDP or foreign currency reserve was $37 billion. And the country was totally debt-free. After the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq was in debt of $87 billion. And their debt is the country is just totally collapsed, basically. So what we can see in terms of Ethiopia's situation, we can end up with similar situation. So from a small conflict to just taking care of this one piece of land on the north, which can create serious knock-on effect with the other countries. So there's a potential risk for countries like Sudan can also escalate things. Okay. And in terms of this individual level, the other problem is when individual thinks that they can occupy or rule a particular land or particular country, there is a famous quote that if a land has got Kalashnikovs, it cannot occupy that country. Just Kalashnikovs. If you look at the northern part of Ethiopia, just Tigrayan people. I think there are like 250,000 soldiers there, fully armed. Not only like Kalashnikovs, there are like all kinds of arms there. So if Abiy Ahmed was thinking that, he will occupy or control that land, that's not going to happen. Okay? So that's individual and state level, how it's working. The third is like regional level. If you look at like Africa Union's role here, I think a couple of months ago there was actually African Union summit about children's nutrition, and I think in the African Union summit no one mentioned about the Tigrayan people, how they are starving, their children are starving. So we are talking about the African Union. This is like the most powerful regional body. They don't touch those things. So that's not a good sign, okay? One of the things when you want to move the international community, we call this kind of regional organization, they're the gatekeeper. Like if you talk about like League of Arab States, okay? So if you look at the Syria and Libya comparison, in terms of Syria war, League of Arab States was divided. But in terms of Libya, it says that, yeah, we don't need this guy. So you can see like with Libya, it was easy. The regime change just happened quickly. But with Syria, regime is still alive there. Okay? So the regional gatekeepers are really, really important because if these people are proactive, that can actually push things in the Security Council as well, who are the main actors in this international system. So one of the other problem is, in terms of international relations, we call it the system is anarchic. There is no supreme authority on the top. Okay, any country can actually attack any country any day. No one can stop it. Okay, so it's like self-help system. But there is a risk there as well. So if you do it, you have to make sure that the consequences. And we saw like in terms of Iraq invasion or Afghanistan, any country has got Kalashnikov, it cannot occupy. See? So like if you look at example of Israel-Palestine thing, see, Israel has got finest weapons. So the children are throwing stones towards them. See? You just cannot occupy those countries forever. Eventually this will collapse. So the Ethiopia's, whatever the governance is, they have to find an idea that how to live together. You can fragment those countries, but the problem is even the fragmentation is not easy. If you look at the Northern Ireland in like UK's like political system, it created serious chaos in the like 70s, 80s. And at the end, some kind of peace process. It's just give and take. Another example is like, in terms of this, like how the Tigrayan were excluded from the negotiation process, that's a bad sign. Okay? So another example is like East Timor. East Timor was a former colony of Portugal, and then it was occupied by Indonesia. In 1999, when there was an opportunity through the UN to have their kind of self-determination. So the Indonesia was the occupier, but in the negotiation process, even the Security Council thought that we need the consent from Indonesia as well. So that's the way the negotiation works. You have to talk to your enemy even, if you really want peace. Okay? So in terms of regional level, I don't think African Union is doing the right work now. Okay, so that's a problem area. So they will not play that role as a kind of gatekeeper. And I think that there is a problem, African Union historically, sometimes they call themselves, just like club for the dictators in Africa. So that's a kind of problem area as well. So I think my other speakers and colleagues were saying about this like civil society's role and things. I mean, in a war situation, civil society's role is always minimal because it's just you are in that euphoria. If you look at the Sri Lanka, like Tamil Tiger, 20 years, 30 years, country being destroyed, divided, still there was a military solution, but the country never actually reconciled from that conflict. Okay. So there are serious stakes here. You're talking about Horn of Africa, the security the Red Sea, and all those areas. You can look at the Gulf countries, how they are playing their role in this war as well, because they have got their own stakes there as well. So like what actually Henry Kissinger, I mean, personally I don't like him, you know, because of his things he believes in, but at the same time, he's actually right in one thing, that at the end of the day, because the system is anarchic, it means, I mean, if you want to make peace in this system, the powerful countries have to cooperate. Okay, if they don't cooperate, then that's not going to happen. So if you compare this with the Ukraine situation, you can see China has to get involved. Russia has to get involved. America has to get involved. Those things we are not doing. See, what we are seeing here is the kind of, you know, this former Yugoslavia kind of situation. And the problem is, like, whenever the central government or whoever it is, if one group trying to maximize their position, there will be always backlash. And eventually, it will create serious problems. So like, from like Ethiopia's this like rise in terms of their, you know, economy and everything, and now this civil war, and now we don't know how this will end, because suddenly international community is more focused in like Ukraine. In the international system, we use something called 911 problem. So basically, you know, as a human being, if you have got any problem, you call 911 and someone will pick up the phone and ambulance will come. And in the international system, there's no 911. Sometimes it works. It depends on which country is calling 911. So if it is Somalia or Ethiopia, no one will pick up the phone. See? So at the end of the day, actually, you know, is the Ethiopians, the civil society, whoever they are, the stake is so high here. Okay? It's not only the state's disintegration, but the people, the populace. And the problem is, if the whole system, that subsystem collapses, that will not be good for anyone. Not for Abiy Ahmed or not for like any other rulers in that like subsystem. When, you know, the things are like kind of a bit becoming positive over the years, and suddenly you ended up with this kind of totally unnecessary war. So, I mean, with my other colleagues, I'm really kind of pessimistic, because part of me, I teach international relations. I mean, the states are bad guys. No, there are no good guys in the international system. They'll do whatever they need to do, and then people just like follow through. But the problem is, war is never a solution. I mean, I'll just finish with like this final example where during the Korean War, it seems like this coalition they created, it almost looks like they were winning. At one point, China got involved in that Korean War. And then America was suddenly losing the thing. And during that time, the five-star general, MacArthur, was talking to Truman. And he was saying that, can you actually use nuclear weapon? We are losing. We have to win this war. What Truman did, he actually sacked him. So you can see it. So war is not a solution. It will not go anywhere. I've got no answer, like, I mean, what to do here. But I think these are the couple of options. The powerful countries need to be involved. How you mobilize them, I don't know. It's like, you know, part of IPP. Like this IPP can actually play a role here, or international community, whatever it is. Because once that famine happens, that will be a different ballgame. And then everyone will go after Abiy Ahmed. Okay, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We still have some minutes left, and before we go to the questions, I would still like to give you the opportunity to ADEM and you, LIDET, maybe also to add to each other if you want. Do you want to add something which was not touched upon yet? Yes, please, ADEM.
Thank you very much. I think, you know, he was talking a lot about how experiences from other places can have some useful insights for Ethiopia, and particularly how the African Union may have kind of provided some cover, whether deliberately or not, or at least by the lack of consensus for Ethiopia in terms of being an agenda at the UN Security Council and other things. But bro, I think overall we understand that it's a region that is complex, and perhaps in terms of geopolitics, one of the key countries we should always remember is Egypt. Even though they may not be directly involved, they have an interest, mainly because of issues around the GERD, and in that regard also because connected with Sudan as well. And so if we have to talk about the geopolitics, we have to center it, in my opinion, on Egypt and Sudan, and how that then implicates not just the United States, but also the Middle Eastern countries. But overall, I think he's right that particularly more recently, I don't know any conflict that is as big as the civil war in Ethiopia, they said, in recent African memory. And in a context like that, it's virtually impossible. And I think LIDET has kind of made that point very clearly as well. And we can only hope that the parties not only understand this, but also they act upon it, that they cannot find what they want through war. And that obviously means that they have to make progress towards finding a peaceful solution to it. But I just wanted to add the Egyptian angle and how then that reverberates in terms of the policies of the United States and also some of the Middle Eastern countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. LIDET, do you want to add something?
Yes, just, I mean, the context that we are, discussing, and then the context of this discussion is largely the conflict in the north. But I also just, wanted to say a few things about how, like, there are other silent wars, so to say, in Ethiopia, particularly in Oromia and Benshangul Gumuz. And it's very interesting and depressing at the same time, because of all the conflicts in the country, and a lot of these also feed on each other. For example, the conflicts in Oromia, some of the armed groups there have some links to TPLF, for example. Again, this is, alliances of actors that are aggrieved against the state or against this other actor, forming alliances. And so looking into the future, one shouldn't assume, particularly international observers shouldn't assume that this is the conflict that in Ethiopia, like a break or make sort of conflict. It's a very big one. It's very detrimental to the future of the state. However, we shouldn't also underestimate the kind of humanitarian crisis that is going on in the other parts of the country, that humanitarian actors, I must also admit, have sort of been silent about. So they haven't, I don't feel they have advocated as much for the humanitarian disasters in other parts of the region. And I think both Ethiopians, political actors in Ethiopia, but also international observers and international actors should look at the situation in a more of a holistic manner. And I think in only addressing the issues in a holistic manner, could we actually achieve something more sustainable. I think just even if we were to succeed at, solving this, the northern conflict, we would not have something durable in Ethiopia unless we consider the other conflicts in the country as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there any question here in the audience? Luca?
So, my name is Luka Cekic, and I have a question. I'm coming from the Balkans, as you have mentioned, my former country, if I may say so, Yugoslavia. You were talking about the international community to be involved in the peace process and everything. And if you take, for an example, the peace negotiations in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Dayton agreements in 1995, it created peace in a way, and it created a new country, let's say, which is basically a continuation of Yugoslavia if we think about the three constituent people who live in Bosnia. But did it solve the issue? This is also a thing that we must remember, that even if the international community is influencing or is trying to offer peace or to build peace in a conflict situation, the product is not always a good one. I'm not saying that Bosnia is a failed state or a failed country, not at all. at least they have peace, but it's not that one should at least have peace. It has to be a reconciliation and a peacefully coexistence and co-living of the people. So maybe this is also an interesting thing to touch upon and to learn from the conflict in Yugoslavia. Especially my dear colleague MOGES always compares the situation in Ethiopia with the one which was in Yugoslavia. So maybe to build a bit upon that. Thank you. Yes, about reconciliation.
Because I'm pretty sure that also our guests from Ethiopia can probably also touch upon that one.
Should I come along?
Yeah, you can start. Yeah.
I mean, I'm quite critical about it's like the way the Bosnian problem solved at the end. I mean, the peace deal came actually after Srebrenica massacre, which cost like almost 8,000 people's lives. Basically, Serbian forces came and then picked up all the young people, randomly put on the truck, and then next 48 hours shot them. That peace could have happened, like more or less 5 years before. So you can see the peace trigger came once that violence happened, you see. Then the international community jumped in. They said, oh my God, what's happening here? So if you compare this like Ethiopia situation, Ethiopia can have that kind of trigger point where you can see that a huge number of people can actually die. And then need to stop this. So I think in terms of Bosnia's scene, what we see is called negative peace. It's the cessation of violence, but not the positive peace. So the positive peace has to come through the people, what kind of society, what kind of country they want for themselves. You cannot impose those things. I mean, thanks.
Maybe there is also a question on the chat, and I think it's also related to a little bit what was said now about Bosnia-Herzegovina. It is, I guess, to both of you, how do you see the upcoming process of the national dialogue, which has been entrusted to a newly founded ND Commission, while the civil society actors who were at the forefront of pushing this issue for the past 2 years seem to have been a bit sidelined? Who would like to talk about this? Adam, maybe you start.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, sorry, I didn't pick the name of my friend from the Balkans, but he made a good point in the sense that if Ethiopia is to move forward, it would have to find something that doesn't just lead to a cessation of hostilities, but also a process that can then advance into a more democratic dispensation. I think Ethiopia is too diverse. And the conflict, despite the fact that there is identity involved, a consociational arrangement of the sort in Bosnia and Herzegovina would first of all not be adopted. I think it's very unlikely that it would be adopted in Ethiopia. There would have to be, we have to find ways, if Tigray choose to continue to be part of Ethiopia, to include them in national politics. It doesn't necessarily have to be the armed group itself, but the people of Tigray would have to be brought into the center of the Ethiopian politics. But I would find it extremely unlikely that we would pursue a process like the Balkans, at least in the context of Ethiopia. And then secondly, I think this links up to what LIDET said at the end of her second intervention, and also it kind of touched on to what Doris is asking about the national dialogue process. I think the point that LIDET was trying to make is also that, despite the fact that the larger conflict is in the north, the larger humanitarian issues are in the north, the background, the roots of the conflict are actually nationwide. And so, there is need for a peace process to silence the guns, but to actually address the larger issues, we'll need to involve the entire country. Because the kind of arrangement that Tigray wants, the kind of federal arrangement, the kind of self-determination that the Tigray needs to have, affects the entire country. So it's not just Tigray, but it's also for Amhara, it's also for Somalia, it's also for the rest of the country. And therefore, what we need, the part that directly involves the North is really cessation of hostilities and then bringing them to the national dialogue process. And I think that's the most central part. We can have a sort of a peace deal to silence the guns, but ultimately finding the answers to the historical narratives and the intra-group and inter-group contestations, and of course the issue of democracy as well would have to be addressed first through the national dialogue process and ultimately through a free and fair election. And so, Doris is right that, I wouldn't say they were excluded. I think the government kind of took ownership of the process. And I think it's critical because it on its own does not have the resources, does not have the state capacity to guarantee peace, to support a national dialogue process in a formal, organized way, and also to kind of at least guarantee that the outcomes of it will be presented in a political process. And so the government has kind of taken ownership of it. The question is, are they genuine? And also, and this is very important, we need to have a coalition of opposition forces and civil society and the broader public that supports the national dialogue, that focus on the national dialogue so that it succeeds, and then it leads to a democratic dispensation. I think so. Making sure that the government delivers on the dialogue, one, and then secondly, also having a coalition that supports, that counterbalances, and tries to hold the government to comply with its promises would be critical. And of course, I think, and I would say one thing, not so connected to this, but there's the issue of justice, of course, not just for what happened during this particular war, but throughout the last 3 or 4 decades. And so it doesn't, of course, it's very unlikely, and I think I'm actually not against it. It doesn't have to be, a focus on a Western-style punishment court, special court, whatever kind of justice, but a process of truth-telling, of reconciliation, that reconciles first the elites, so that there's some kind of settlement, and then leads to truth-telling and reconciliation among the community. And I think so prioritizing the national dialogue so that there's some kind of elite settlement and then pursuing a justice process would be critical. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. LIDET, would you like to add to the national dialogue and also the role of civil society there, and which was said to be sidelined in this process a bit?
Yeah. Let me also respond to the question on the role of international actors, because I think that's an important one, in that I think when the war broke and through the process, I think there has been, and I think a lot of lessons have been learned in terms of the international community, but also the media, and the adverse effects of lacking nuance in one's understanding of context, for example, or maybe perhaps also quickness to judge who the good guys and who the bad guys are. And I think a lot of international actors have since then maybe also revisited their understanding of what the issues at hand are and what constructive approaches, not necessarily good-looking approaches, but constructive approaches would be like going forward. So I think while a lot of lessons have been learned in how to engage better in such complex manners, you are absolutely right in saying that eventually this is also like, be it the mediation between the TPLF and the federal government, but also the national dialogue in Ethiopia, this is a process that should at the base be led and owned by Ethiopians. And this is true in every context, but in Ethiopia particularly so, because the history of Ethiopian state formation is very different, and there's some things against, I mean, as a society or the states sort of, how do you say, like need to stand on its own or to defend and to push back against some things that things are pushed on by Westerners or international actors. So I think in order to ensure that this process, be it the national dialogue or the other ongoing negotiations, are owned by Ethiopians, time is very important, and process again is very important. And oftentimes, there is an approach or propensity to look for the end, to look for the day where the conflicting parties sign that deal and it's televised. I think we're all looking forward to that day, but that shouldn't come at the cost of hashing out critical issues and covering the right topics and including the right actors, and it being accepted by the conflicting parties. So I think, again, coming back to the idea of process and who's really, whether or not the parties have taken their time to hash out issues is very important. And when Obasanjo says that he sees positive, steady but slow process, that is really in the nature of what mediation should be like. And the international community has a role in applying pressure, but it shouldn't be too much. One should find the sweet spot, as they would say. On the national dialogue, I think in addition to the exclusion or participation of CSOs, which ADEM has touched on, there is also the other elephant in the room on the national dialogue, which is who sits at that national dialogue. And are the armed actors, particularly TPLF and the OLA, are they going to be part of this national dialogue, for example? Or is there going to be another path of negotiation for them, and then one then finds their inclusion in the process somewhere down the line? Right now, the TPLF and the OLA, which are the two major armed groups in the country, are considered terrorist groups, legally speaking as well. So their participation in a national dialogue would be sort of difficult, politically difficult to manage. But on the other hand, if you are not able to bridge some of these conflicts that have led the country to violent war, to violent conflict, then could you really put faith in a national dialogue that would be effective going forward? So I think the participation, who's going to sit in this national dialogue, and that whole process is one of the things that I think going forward also needs to be clarified, and where already questions have been raised. Yeah, and then to reiterate also what Adem said on, okay, even if we had the right people participating in this process, how are we going to identify the agendas, and eventually who's going to also take the government to account to make sure that the recommendations of this Reconciliation Commission are, for example, implemented? Because what is really the point of a national dialogue that is had if it's not, if some of its recommendations are not implemented? And for now, we haven't really discussed the mechanisms of the implementation yet. So going forward, that would also be another thing to see as part and parcel of national dialogue, and national dialogue being a stepping stone for achieving peace in Ethiopia. Thank you.
We do have time for one more question, so Luca will read it out because it's online, and I would then also like you then to answer it with your last remarks. But please, the question first.
Yes, so the guest from the audience is saying the following thing. Do you think that, just a second, do you think that the negotiations between the federal government and the TPLF will be fruitful while the military troops, the Eritrean military troops, are still invading the northern and western part of Tigray? What is your opinion? And he thanks to all of the panelists for their nice discussion.
Who would like to respond?
I can try, maybe?
Yes.
I mean, the Eritrea TPLF relationship, or the Eritrea factor, again, is why I also think our understanding of what this negotiation should be about needs to expand in a way. And it doesn't necessarily mean you pull everyone together to sit on the same table. However, one would have to make the effort to consider the concerns of the other involved parties when negotiating with the different actors. And so far, again, the mediation process so far has been opaque. Like, the federal government doesn't even, openly admit that there is a process going on and that there are negotiations going on. But from what we know, we haven't really seen Obasanjo, for example, engaging with the Eritreans or engaging at the regional level with the Amhara political stakeholders and Afar political stakeholders. So it could be that these things are going in the background, but we shouldn't, going back to the theory, but also the practice of what we have seen in this war. What happens is actors that have interest express their interest, and if their interests are not met, and if they feel like there are no channels or chances where their interests would be met, then they would make themselves important by using force. I mean, that's what force does. I mean, force is an extension of politics that couldn't be achieved by other means. So in a way, the Eritrean role could also be that. But while the reduction in violence is definitely, a stepping stone to negotiations, I also don't think one should wait for the cessation of hostilities completely before negotiations could start, because negotiations could also expedite cessation of hostilities, including with Eritrea in this case.
Thank you very much. Yes, Adem, you first.
Yeah, thank you. I think LIDET has touched on it. The key here is, and it's very important, one, initially Eritrea's involvement may have been questionable and all, right? But since then, and we hear about reports of Eritreans supporting the federal government and Amhara forces in the western part. But what we can say is that technically the Ethiopian government has the right to let them be there, right? It's very important, and we can say now for sure that there is, they are not there against the consent of the Ethiopian government. That's the first point. And secondly, there's a lot of implication, and it's true that the Eritrean army has been extremely violent, right? They have committed a lot of crimes, and because they have committed crimes, there is a sense that there's a tendency to ignore the interests, the desires, some of them legitimate, that they have. And so just because they have committed crimes, it doesn't mean you have to ignore their interests. And if the standard is about committing crimes, it's the same with the TPLF. They have committed as much. I think there's a tendency to compare the crimes. But if you look at what the TPLF has done in isolation, it's a serious case of accusations of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And so, we cannot simply say that because they have committed a crime, they have to be excluded. They have genuine interest. They have a history with the TPLF. The TPLF-led Ethiopian government essentially undermined the sovereignty, the interests of Eritrea for 2 decades almost, since the war in 1998. The country was completely isolated because Ethiopia is seen as a bigger member of the African community, the African Union, but also a bigger partner for the West. And so we have to recognize, in as much as they have been accused of committing serious crimes, we have to recognize they have interests, they have a history, and they also want protection from a potential engagement. And so the right way, in my opinion, is to actually put them as part of the process. And of course, ultimately, if there is a sense of peace, it shouldn't, whether in my opinion, I think they'll be able to leave then. Because ultimately, the problem is not that the Eritrean army is they're controlling alongside Ethiopian and the Amhara army controlling the areas. But the problem, particularly among Tigrayans, is that they do not want anyone there, right? They want to take it back. So it's not about Eritrea, it's about reclaiming it. And so I don't think Eritrea should be the reason. And it's also true that Eritrea controls some parts in the north as a kind of a strategic depth against the potential offensive from the TPLF. But again, all of that can be resolved, but I don't think it should be able to stand in the way of building on the momentum.
Thank you. Abdullah?
Just a couple of quick points. I mean, as an outsider, when a particular group which is very strong, which is one of those key actors in this whole conflict, and if you try to exclude them, and you are saying that you are going for this negotiation process, I think there is lots of bad faith here. And I don't think that will work eventually. And the problem is this terrorism, who is terrorist, who is not terrorist. These are so fluid. At one point, Nelson Mandela was on terrorist list, in 1980s. During the Second World War, before the Second World War, Stalin was the most vicious man in the Western world. Just before Second World War, he became Uncle Joe. And that, put a spin on that. And suddenly the bad guy became, brother. So the international system is quite fluid in those things. So I think what I'm seeing here, the government is trying to push this negative peace. They've got no interest in for the sustainable peace, like long-term peace. And the other problem is in terms of international peacekeeping, one of the famous quotes is, we call it like, thou shalt not make peace unless there is a peace to keep. It looks like when the things are militarized everywhere, it looks like people don't want peace there actually. You have to demilitarize the whole thing, and then you can go for peace. It's a process, it's a science. You just cannot rush it. You just cannot rush it. You have to have all those things there in place. Otherwise, you will just end up with like the Bosnia situation or like Cyprus situation. The society, community will be divided for years. So I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Time is already limited, but since I'm the moderator, I still take the opportunity in 1 minute to ask one last question, but very, very shortly to all of you. And it would be like, what would be your wish, if you would have a wish, for the next 10 years for Ethiopia? Maybe, ADEM, 1 minute.
Well, very simple for me. I think if the dialogue succeeds and if in 2026 we have a genuinely free and fair elections, that would be a tremendous achievement. And of course, that means that we have peace as well.
Thank you so much. LIDET, your wish for Ethiopia?
I think if we manage to unpack some of the fundamental questions in Ethiopian history and the Ethiopian politics, and if we are at peace with them, I think for me that's already a big achievement, if they don't become a cause for violence.
Thank you so much. Your wish. You need the microphone because, yeah.
I mean, with me, like peace is always multilateral. You just cannot, make peace with like one group and not another group. That will never work. So the peace has to be inclusive with all the parties involved here. And if you don't do it, it's not going anywhere. And I think one of the key actors should actually get involved proactively is that regional gatekeeper, African Union. Okay, they can put serious pressure on the Security Council, all those big, powerful states. And only through them, you can see like you can move things there. But it looks like on the ground, its situation is still very, very dangerous. And I think there is a very good chance the famine situation can seriously escalate. And I think that will be a serious thing to happen for Africa when Africa was just trying to bounce back. And so we must not allow it to happen. Thanks.
Thank you so much from my side. Thanks to all the speakers. For me, it was extremely interesting and important also to learn a little bit more about all the dynamics. And I think it was quite clear how multi-layered all the different conflicts are. And I think LIDET also mentioned it. There are also some silent conflicts within the country. And it's not only everything limited to the north. I think this is very important. And what I would also like to add from my side is we should not forget also about peace, that we also need to work for peace even in peaceful times. And I think we tend to forget this as well. And this is one thing I would like to add. And then let me thank you so much for your time. It was extremely interesting. It was important. I think we should discuss a lot more, even also within the European Union, about issues on the African continent. I think we are not doing it enough. I think it's very important. Thanks so much for your very elaborate answers and all your ideas. I really think it was very important. Thanks especially to MOGES, who curated this whole event, so he put a lot of effort in it. I hope to see you soon, maybe here in Vienna. That would be perfect, in person maybe. And enjoy your evening, and thanks to everyone on our online social media. We were live streaming, and I already said it on Facebook, on YouTube, and also via Zoom, and we also recorded it, so we will still put out the recording in like a couple of days and weeks. So enjoy your evening, and it was a pleasure. Goodbye.
Thank you very much for having us again. Pleasant evening.
Thank you.